Good evening and welcome to this event, co-sponsored by the Philadelphia chapter of the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art and the Wayne Art Center in Wayne, Pennsylvania. My name is Peter Archer. I'm the Vice President of the chapter. I would first like to thank our sponsors for doing all they do to allow events like this to happen. Our gold sponsors, Cappelletti Builders, North American Window and Door, Peter Zimmerman Architects, Pine Mar Builders, Tradewood Windows and Doors. Our silver sponsors, Archer and Buchanan Architecture, Duration Molding and Millwork, Ernst Brothers Builders, John Milner Architects, LePage Millwork, Rittenhouse Builders, Inspire Builders. Also thanks to Adesso Marble and Granite, Griffiths Construction, Polig Builders, Cherokee Construction, Everline Design Consultants, and Soundways Custom Home Integration, Stone Glidden. A quick note, if you're not yet a member of the ICAA, please do become a member. Just go on classicist-phila.org and click on membership. We'd love to have you join. We've got lots of wonderful events happening, especially we're putting together a really wonderful series of programs, lectures, tours, social gatherings for the fall and winter season. Tonight we're going to hear about and see some wonderful images of the Cassatt family and their notable mansions and country houses. I personally have a special affinity as I grew up next to my favorite Cassatt house, country house of Beaupre in Rosemont. It became a retirement home, and I actually worked there during after school and during summers during high school. So look forward to seeing what it's looking like. So now I would like to introduce our speaker, Jeff Groff, who will describe in living color much about the families and their magnificent houses. Jeff Groff is an estate historian at Winterthur Museum, Garden and Library. He also served as Director of Public Programs and Director of Interpretation. For 16 years, he was Executive Director of Wick Historic House and Garden in Germantown, in the Germantown section of Philadelphia. He directed the Osterville Historical Society on Cape Cod, and early in his career, he was Register Assistant Curator at the Philadelphia Maritime Museum, now Independent Seaport. A graduate of Bates College, where he majored in history, Jeff holds a MA from the Winterthur program in Early American Culture of the University of Delaware. For over 40 years, Jeff has studied and lectured on American country houses and gardens, particularly those of Philadelphia's main line and surrounding areas, with emphasis on country life and sports and gentleman farming. He served as co-curator of Winterthur's very successful exhibitions, Costumes of Downton Abbey, who didn't love that, and Costuming the Crown. So without further ado, I welcome Jeff Groff. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, and I'm delighted to be with everyone this evening and to talk about one of my particular interests, the mansions of the Cassatt family. And I was fascinated to hear from Peter that he had grown up near Beaupre, and we will indeed be looking at that. Well, it is a kind of an interesting story spotlighting on this one particular family and their impact on industry in the main line, but also all the notable houses they had constructed and the architects that they worked with. The Cassatts were not old Philadelphia descendants of colonial or Quaker ancestors, very much became part of the fabric of the city and leaders. I think maybe because they weren't old line Philadelphia, they lived a little bit more elegantly, grandly, and collected a remarkable collection of impressionists. Just to set the context, if some of you aren't as aware of this, is in the late 19th century, early 20th century, when the Cassatts are building so many of their country places, Philadelphia was considered the workshop of the world. It was a center of major industry. That's the Baldwin Locomotive Works at the upper left that was on Broad Street back then, largest manufacturer of locomotives in the world. And so many of the Baldwin officers and executives had mainline estates. But more than that, textiles, it was a major production center. More carpets were made in Philadelphia than anywhere else in the country. Shipbuilding, all sorts of manufacturing, and a lot of heavy industry, building machines to build other things. And back then, if you were going to buy a saw or an axe or hammers, things like that, it's likely that they were being made in Philadelphia. And then the main line, a term I'm sure is familiar with most of you, but just to position it as we start out, the nickname came from the main line of public works of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And that was the original train line coming west from the city of Philadelphia from the 1830s that would head out towards the Susquehanna River. In the 1850s, the Pennsylvania Railroad purchased that railroad line, the main line, and the right-of-ways along it. And they would begin, particularly after the Civil War, to develop it. They also started renaming the villages to make them more attractive as a summer resort, as a place to build a suburban or a villa or a country place. And so Humphreysville became Bryn Mawr, Reeseville became Berwyn, Appensville became Ardmore. Again, giving it a little bit more sort of status or clout, these Welsh, English, or Irish names. Sort of narrowly defined, the main line were the stops from the city border at Overbrook out to Paoli, and that's how it's been seen over the years. In April of 1950, Holiday magazine, which some of you may remember, did a large issue focused on Philadelphia's main line. And the cover illustration sort of perfectly captures that, kind of the apotheosis of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was such a central figure to the main line's development and to the wealth. And the cover illustration also kind of highlighted some of the things that defined it and still continue to define it. This love of all things English, country sports, fox hunting, polo, the various events like the Devon Horse Show, the clubs like the club, but probably more than anything, the interest and love of English style architecture and gardens. Interestingly, that article was written by a young author named James Michener, who was just starting out and would certainly go on to much larger fame. I'm beginning with sort of the key figure in my story, which is Alexander J. Cassatt, who was become president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. We certainly know his sister, Mary, much better, but he was a nationally and internationally known figure in the later 19th century and the early 20th century. It's kind of ironic when Mary would visit Philadelphia periodically. She didn't come over all that often. When she would visit, the papers like the Public Ledger, Philadelphia Inquirer would simply say, President Cassatt's sister coming to visit, not highlighting her career as the artist. But here, of course, we see one of her works. She did a lot of her portraits were of family members. Now, the Cassatts came from Western Pennsylvania, around Pittsburgh area. That's where Alexander was born. His father was a successful banker, and they would move to the Lancaster, Pennsylvania area, continue in banking, and then eventually to Philadelphia. They also spent a fair bit of time in Paris and in Heidelberg. And so because of that, we're very cosmopolitan in sort of their worldview. Alexander Cassatt studied at the Rensselaer Polytech Institute. So he was not only a very savvy businessman, but he was truly trained in engineering and understood the mechanics of a railroad and its operation. As the railroad was trying to develop this area to increase the land values of a lot of the lands and right-of-ways they own, they began doing a variety of different things to attract visitors. And one of the first in 1871 was to build a substantial hotel near the new Bryn Mawr station. It was called the Keystone Hotel, Wilson Brothers were the architects who did a lot of work for the Pennsylvania Railroad over the years. It became a real social center. In the first year, Alexander Cassatt and his family did come out to stay during some of the summer months. Ironically, the people in Philadelphia were coming out to the main line to escape the heat and humidity, but particularly the pollution that was coming from all of their factories and industries. The Keystone Hotel burned in 1887. Off-season, a fire really destroyed most of it. And it was replaced in 1890 by the building that's very well known today, truly a landmark building designed by the architectural firm of Furness and Evans. And it would continue to be a popular summer place, especially for social events, but many people were starting to build their own summer houses, country places at that time. The Baldwin School for girls would soon lease it during the off season and eventually in the 1920s take over the hotel as it had been completely, but this landmark building is still being beautifully preserved by them. Well, in the early 1870s, the Cassatts acquired about a 50-acre parcel in Haverford along the main line, not far from that train station. And over the years, they expanded what began as kind of a Gothic revival style villa, adding onto it as their collection, and his wealth also grew. The principal architects for so much of that work were Furness and Evans. And if we look at the interior on the right, in many ways, very typical of that period, very much in the taste and style, the textured rugs, the slip-covered upholstery, a lot of pattern and color. I wish we had color images, and wonderful objects of art to sort of suggest their good taste. But the difference between the Cassatts and most of his friends and business colleagues is that they were collecting genre paintings and history paintings and romantic art popular at that time, and many of them were collecting old masters. Cassatt, with his sister Mary as agent, was acquiring Degas and Monet, Renoirs, and others, which baffled many of their friends. And in fact, at that time, the Philadelphia Inquirer, in reviewing some of the Impressionist art, described it as nature gone quite berserk. It was just not something that was really understood at that moment. But Alexander Cassatt really got out in the vanguard in collecting. This is a portrait of his wife, Lois. She was the niece of former United States President James Buchanan. Now, we all know that Buchanan's way down on that list of presidents and has often been termed the worst US president. But at the time they were married, he still brought a great deal of prestige to her and to her family. Interestingly, this portrait of Lois and some of her grandchildren by her sister-in-law, Mary Cassatt. Lois and Mary Cassatt did not get along all that well as we read the various biographies of Mary. Here we find Lois and Alexander in the library of the house, and I'll note several things. This really robust, dynamic fireplace surround, very much sort of in the mode and style we think of in the work of Furness and Evans, these kind of compressed piston-like columns almost, the delineated details of the sort of overmantel, and then the use of more arts and crafts motifs, the sunflower, and some of the more naturalistic elements. But if we look at the room itself, the furnishing is much earlier in style, at least. Some of it may be colonial revival, the chair on the right particularly, which I think is trying to make a connection to the prestige of the colonial era, our earlier ancestors. Now, like so many of these people, particularly the Cassatt family, but so many Philadelphians, an overriding theme to all of their activities is things that are related to equestrian. And Alexander Cassatt's particular interest was in carriage driving. especially four-in-hand coaches, which you see here. He went so far to be involved with Montgomery Avenue, which still runs west to east along the main line today, to having that paved with macadam because it provided a much better surface for him for his carriage drives. His neighbor in Haverford was Clement Grisco in another Furness and Evans designed house called Dolabrand, happily a house that has survived and has been well preserved. Clement Griscom was from a family that had made a fortune in shipping, very involved in the creation of the International Mercantile Marine Company. He would become president of that. The Pennsylvania Railroad, large investors in that firm. And in fact, the Pennsylvania Railroad, International Mercantile Marine, would come to control the White Star Line. And that is why there were so many notable and wealthy Philadelphians on the maiden voyage of the Titanic because of that strong connection. Fortunately, Clement Griscom, who had not been well, was not on that maiden voyage, but there are a number of well-known names like Widener, family of Philadelphia, who were. Sort of nestled between Cheswold and Dolabrand was the house, a much more modest house on a smaller lot of the John Thayers. And it was designed by Knickerbocker Boyd, another one of the notable Philadelphia architects, who sort of comfortably worked in this style, which blended Tudor details and then more arts and crafts elements. John Thayer was vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He and his family were on board the Titanic. Sadly, he did not survive, but his teenage son, who was nicknamed Jack Thayer, did survive. Now, in this small world way, he would go on to become a vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he would marry the granddaughter of Alexander and Lois Cassatt. 1881 was a big year for Alexander Cassatt. He had been in charge of overseeing the building of Broad Street Station, the main terminal for the Pennsylvania Railroad in Philadelphia. It was the work of Wilson Brothers and Company again. It would later be expanded in the early 1890s, but at that point, it was Furness and Evans who do the alterations and the addition. But this is launching the railroad as such a significant force in the area, its prominence and Cassatt's sort of success in pulling this all off. But that year, Colonel Thomas Scott, president of the railroad, has died, and Cassatt, I think, fully believes he will be elevated to the presidency, and he's not. George Brooke Roberts becomes president of the railroad. So understandably, Cassatt steps back and he said, my farm needs me. He had a large gentleman's farm, we'll talk about in a moment, and so he resigns from the railroad. Now, people often wonder, he's able to do so much in the years he's not working for the railroad, creating a number of houses, a substantial farm and estate. How is he doing that financially? Well, he does have the family's banking firm, Cassatt and Company, which he's connected to. He also had heavily invested in Westinghouse and Company, a number of coal mines and other enterprises. So although he gets out on a limb at times, he does have a steady stream. For his Philadelphia house, and keep in mind these mainline houses were country places, weekend or seasonal houses. In Philadelphia, like so many of the prominent city Philadelphians, his house was on Rittenhouse Square at 202 South 19th Street. It had originally been built for a man named Fairman Rogers. Well, when Cassatt purchases it, he brings in Furness and Evans to substantially remodel and do alterations on this house. In the early 1900s, his summer house up in Bar Harbor, Maine, where so many Philadelphians are going, is finished. It's called 4 Acres, a large shingle-style house, the work of the architects Chapman and Fraser. You can see from the image on the right that very much the interior styles we probably define as arts and crafts. There's a lot of stickly furniture and things that would have been felt appropriate and comfortable for a summer house. On the upper image, we see a portion of the house from the water, and below the stable and carriage house, almost more in a stick style. Well, this house would eventually be purchased and torn down by the Edward Stotesburys, who would build a much, much larger house on that site designed by Henry Magaziner of Philadelphia. And then that in turn would eventually be torn down. And today, if you go to Bar Harbor, and particularly if you go on from Bar Harbor on the ferry to Nova Scotia, the ferry terminal is on the site of this earlier. Like a lot of Philadelphians, Cassatt was a yachtsman. He purchased a sizable steam yacht called the Enterprise, and you see Lois and Alexander Cassatt on the afterdeck of that yacht enjoying the cruise. But Chesterbrook was his big focus. And in 1880-81, he was starting to acquire a number of existing farms out in Chester County in Berwyn to put together this substantial country place, very much in the mode of gentlemen farmers of that day. A lot of articles were written about it and the success of his breeding programs there at Chester. Here's a view looking over towards Valley Forge Mountain from sort of the area that would be along where Route 202 is today. And an article in 1901 described it as one grand carpet of green. It really was a community like so many of these country gentlemen farms, such as Winterthur or Ardrossan. A lot of people living and working here. There was really kind of a village, blacksmith shops, schools, multiple barns for the different operations, dairy cattle, beef cattle, hackney horses, and also thoroughbred racehorses that were being raised here. Furness and Evans did the barns, not unsurprisingly. And the whole kind of color scheme picking out and identifying the buildings of this estate was Tuscan red and gold, which were the colors. Also on the property was probably a late colonial era house that was expanded and remodeled to be almost a country retreat clubhouse for Cassatt and his friends to come out on a weekend and use. It was kept fairly simple, trying not to be an elegant place as to his other residences. After Cassatt's death in 1906, the property was inherited by his son, Edward Buchanan Cassatt. He had been very much a military officer, colonel, lieutenant colonel in the Army, successful career there, but he was very focused on the farming activities and also raising prize-winning horses. He brought in the architect Wilson Eyre to do some remodeling on the house. It now evolves into a more comfortable and sizable country seat, not just a rustic retreat. And here you have one of the interior renderings that Eyre did for the library. So you can just get a sense from this. This is trying to make it a more substantial and elegant structure. Well, after Colonel Cassatt's death in 1922, the property was inherited by his widow, who lived till 1962. And after her death, after a number of sort of battles back and forth locally over zoning, over planning, the whole 600 plus acre property would be divided up and developed. And now if you drive along Route 202, say coming from Westchester headed towards King of Prussia, you will see Chesterbrook is a large complex of corporate centers, single family houses, many condominiums, and a shopping center. Alexander Cassatt was a member of the Farmers Club. And in many ways, this was the most exclusive club in Philadelphia because there were only 12 members at a time. Each of them took a turn, one a month, hosting a dinner for their fellow farmers, as they were called. They were very serious about their activities, scientific, agriculture, sort of corporate management techniques to create greater efficiencies on these farms, also to improve livestock and crops in general that would have a much larger benefit. But they also had a really good time at their dinners. And the minutes of their various gatherings are fun and fascinating to read. Well, I don't have a picture of a Farmers Club dinner, so I'm substituting this Gilded Age dinner, and I suspect it may have not been all that different. The New York Times in 1904 talked about a dinner that Alexander Cassatt hosted, definitely a grand black tie affair, and he had made for it miniature silver hoes, rakes, pitchforks to be used for eating the oysters, the salad, the entree, and other things. So they're having a lot of fun, and it's very much sort of positioning it in this moment of Gilded Age life. 1899, Cassatt is literally lured back to become president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. It had been struggling with several different projects, and I think he was definitely seen as the person who could turn around, and he did. He turned it into the largest corporation in America, if not the world. His friend Clement Grisco, I think, was both the one who really advocated for bringing him back and also probably convinced Alexander Cassatt to take that role. He was reluctant. And here's his portrait around that time done by John Singer Sargent. Well, Cassatt's probably his biggest legacy was taking this initiative and sort of a leap to bring the railroad into Manhattan with the building of the tunnels under the Hudson River, also tunnels going out under the East River over towards Long Island and beyond. And of course, the centerpiece of this whole project was Pennsylvania Station, designed by McKim, Mead, and White. Well, sadly, Cassatt did not live to see the completion of the station and the project. But by 1904, the tunnels from under the Hudson River had been completed. And so he was aware of the progress as it went along. But to memorialize Cassatt, a large statue of him was done by the sculptor Carl Bitter and was a centerpiece in Pennsylvania Station. Carl Bitter was also well known for doing a lot of work with Frank Furness on furnace design buildings, a lot of bas-relief plaques and decoration and things of that nature. Now, it was Samuel Ray who was overseeing the project, trained as an engineer, also from around the Pittsburgh area, and he would see it through to completion and also eventually become president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Now, Ray also had a mainline estate, and it was called Waverly Heights and Gladwin. And a number of you may recognize that name. It's been a continuing care community for a number of years. And this is the manor house that was completed around 1913 for Ray's estate. It was the work of Furness and Evans, the successor company, and probably Charles Willing was lead architect at that time on this project. Well, sadly, in 1905, things begin to sort of decline for Alexander Cassatt. He's very stressed with everything that's going on in the railroad in terms of business. His daughter, Catherine, dies at a young age at their winter home down in Aiken, South Carolina, of goiter disease, which was still a serious concern at that time, really devastating in many ways for Alexander and Lois. And at the Church of Redeemer in Bryn Mawr, not far from their Cheswold property, they commissioned Tiffany to design these memorial windows. In the summer of 1906, Cassatt catches whooping cough. It's speculated perhaps from one of his grandchildren, and this begins to really accelerate the decline of his health. And sadly, in December, he dies at his Rittenhouse Square house at only age 67. Press nationally and internationally lauds him as a true titan of industry and someone who had made such a mark on America and its expansion. Well, right next door to the Cheswold estate of the Cassatts was the Marion Cricket Club. And it wasn't its first location. It moved here in the late 1890s. And Cassatt was instrumental in the purchase of that land and the creation of the club on this site. Ernest and Evans, again, the architects, first clubhouse they designed, Dutch gambrel roof, colonial revival style, that burned. And in the next iteration, they designed the building you see today. Unfortunately, that burned too. So this is really the third clubhouse, but it replicated the second one and is a landmark today, not only on the main line, but a well-known and important work that is known around the country. But I particularly mention it because on the corner of Montgomery Avenue and Gray's Lane is this relief done by Carl Bitter as a memorial to Alexander Cassatt on one of his hackney horses. So if you're from this area and if you haven't noticed that and if you're waiting at the traffic light, do look at that relief. It's beautifully done, and the cricket club maintains that little garden there to this day. Now back to Mary. Of course, she's the one we know so well. She lived in the Philadelphia area a minimal amount of time. Paris is her focus, and that's where her life is so defined and centralized. Her friends like Edgar Degas, you see his portrait of Mary on the left. She was all part of that artistic circle. I think she also found Philadelphia rather provincial, and so she didn't visit that often. Her family mostly went to see her in Paris, sort of understandably. Now, I said there were very few Philadelphians at this time collecting Impressionist works, the work of Mary Cassatt, but some who were connected to her through family or through the railroad officers were beginning to collect those works. And one of the connections is through the Scott family. Earlier, I mentioned Colonel Thomas Scott, president of the Pennsylvania Railroad to 1880. And this was the house of his son, Edgar Scott, and his wife, Mary. Well, Edgar Scott's mother was Anna Riddle Scott. Sorry about all the names and the confusion, but she was a first cousin of Alexander and Mary Cassatt's mother. So this is tying them in pretty close as family members. House on the edge of the main line in Derby, designed by Horace Trumbauer for Mary and Edgar Scott. Next level of connection, down a generation, is Edgar Scott Jr., marries Helen Hope Montgomery, whose family's house is Ardrossan, another great Horace Trumbauer designed house. If you don't know the book by David Nelson Wren that came out a few years ago on Ardrossan, I highly recommend it. It's not only a story of this house and the Montgomerys and the Scotts and the Wheelers, of Trumbauer and his work here, but it's very much a story of Philadelphia and the main line. And indeed, as I'm sure so many of you know, this house and family inspired the playwright Philip Barry to write the Philadelphia story, which became the play and then the movie. On the edge of the property, after Hope and Edgar Scott Jr. married, they took an older house, probably an 18th century house, expanded it. This is the 20s when colonial revival is coming back into being the most popular style, also sort of downscaling. And here you see in the image on the upper left portion of the living room in that house, several works by Mary Cassatt, including this one over the mantelpiece that had belonged to Edgar Scott's grandmother, Anna Riddle Scott. Now, a few more of Alexander and Lois's children. This is Elsie, as she was known for most of her life, Elsie Foster Cassatt Stewart, here in the pastel. And then in a later photograph, this sort of wonderful image of her with one of her terriers. Elsie married a man named Plunkett Stewart. Plunkett Stewart from Baltimore, who was connected to the Cassatt and Company Bank House. He was manager of the New York office of Cassatt and Company, but very much his focus and love was horse-related sports, particularly fox hunting. But on an edge of the Cheswold property, they had built this house variously described as Tudor, as Mediterranean. If you look at the image of those sleeping porches that sort of expand out over the lower level loggia, that does have a bit more of a Mediterranean feel. Architects were Chapman and Fraser, who would then go on to do the Cassatt family house up in Bar Harbor. Well, this house is gone, but the wonderful carriage house stable still survives. And this is true of a number of the buildings, the gatehouse and other features on the Cheswold estate. These were the things preserved and often very creatively transformed into residence. This was the work of Walter Durham, who would end up developing the Cheswold estate starting in the late 30s and going into the 1950s. Now, in 1926, Elsie Stewart, who had inherited the Cheswold property after her mother's death, began a number of improvements and changes. And Greg Pritchard, who I'm sure many of you know and have heard speak for ICAA, discovered this drawing or rendering of the remodeling of the Cheswold house. Interestingly, it says drawn by A.D. McNaughton, and we're not quite sure. We don't find much about him other than this rendering. Was he the draftsman? Was he an architect? This is one of those sort of mysteries or work in progress. But you can see how the architect is transforming that earlier Furness and Evans house, which had kind of fallen out of favor, into this more English vernacular inspired residence. 1929, Elsie Stewart also is adding a very large garage to the property, designed by New York architect Greville Ricard. And you can see not only does it have 7 garage bays, but a whole series of rooms above for chauffeurs and family and visiting chauffeurs who might be bringing their employers down to be guests at a country house party weekend. This garage was transformed into one of the most appealing houses in the Cheswold development. And as you see there, and also it was sort of done a second time and even more effectively by Peter Zimmerman, who's one of our sponsors for. Elsie was also, besides being big into motoring and cars, very interested in fast boats, and she commissioned this cruising yacht, article on it about how speedy it was, and she named it the Enterprise II after her parents' yacht. As I mentioned, Walter Durham, who was so good at developing these mainline estates as they were being divided up, wide variety of architectural styles, each distinctive, landscaping really carefully thought out. So colonial revival, English, French, even Bermuda, Monterey Bay style sort of define these houses and neighborhood. And this is still one of the premier neighborhoods of the main line today. Now, I mentioned Plunkett Stewart, and here you see him in his happier garb as a master of foxhounds. In 1930, Elsie and Plunkett Stewart divorced. Several years before, he had bought several thousand of acres of land down in Unionville, Pennsylvania, for his fox hunting activities. And he would create what is still considered one of the best packs of foxhounds in America today, Mr. Stewart's Cheshire Hounds. He married in 1931 a widow named Carol Harriman Smith, who had property down there. Interestingly, this is this small world thing again. Carol Harriman Smith's husband, who had died, was Robert R. Penn Smith, and R. Penn Smith had been a manager of the Philadelphia office of Cassatt and Company. 1934, they bring in Meller and Meggs to expand an earlier house, modernize it, add this sort of double portico. And it's most likely Arthur Meggs, who's the lead architect on this. He was an avid fox hunter. Alexander Lois's other son was Robert Kelso Cassatt. And you see him in a portrait by his aunt, father on the left, and in later life. Successful businessman, he would go on to manage Cassatt and Company in Philadelphia, but also a savvy investor in coal mines and other industries. He married Minnie Fell, who was described at the time as one of Philadelphia's great heiresses, and she was. She was a member of the Drexel banking family. And it was interesting, when her mother remarried in 1898, she was also a widow. The newspapers had a field day on that, and here you see that the handsomest man in New York wins Philadelphia's richest woman. She married Alexander Van Rensselaer, and they really were sort of at the top of the society mountain in Philadelphia. This was the Fell residence outside of Philadelphia, sort of northwest of Chestnut Hill, that was called Camp Hill, which is where Minnie would have grown up. But Minnie and Robert Cassatt acquire, soon after their marriage, 154 acres in Rosemont, and this will become Beaupre that Peter mentioned in the introduction. If you think about this, Minnie and Robert, at the time they're creating this estate, they're in their 20s. They're a young couple, enormously wealthy because of bringing together sort of these two family fortunes. It was nearly a mile-long drive that came off of Conestoga Road, following this long line of Lombardy poplar trees, setting up the entrance, formal gardens to the right, and then arriving at the house. If you drive along Conestoga Road today, you'll still see the entrance gate that go into the property that was developed then in the 1950s and 60s. So here's the house. We switched to Clement Stewart as the architect. The house, the black and white image as it was first built in 1901. This is a country house. They have a city house as well. 1908, they bring back Clement Stewart and do a significant addition, a whole wing, which you see in the color image coming off to the left. They now have two young sons. They're using this house more of the year. They're entertaining on a larger scale. So this is all kind of defining this expansion. And on the lower right, you see the main reception room, really dating more from that 1901 period. And then on the upper left, the new dining room, this large French-inspired room that could seat over 20 people for dinner. The Robert Cassatts, like many of the time, particularly members of the Drexel family, would summer in Newport, Rhode Island. And this is a house that they had for a number of years during the summer called the Orchard, which still exists today. They also ended up purchasing a property in Cap d'Antibes on the French Riviera, which they would go to in the wintertime. Now, on a parcel of the Beaupre property, on about 8 or 9 acres, they carved out a piece of land for one of their sons, Alexander, and his wife, Cassandra. They brought in around 1928-29, the plans get underway, the firm of Wilson, Eyre, and McIlvaine to design this more English vernacular inspired house. They name it Pleasant Valley, which was the name of the original farm before the Cassatts had purchased the land. If you look at the details, you can see this evolving style around 1930, not only the sort of wonderful use of textured stone and color, but then also the rather kind of spare or streamlined massing of the chimneys reflected of the changing style and taste of the time. Here we have Alexander Cassatt in his portrait by Franklin Watkins. He was a banker, not with Cassatt and Company, but with the Western Saving Fund Society. And his wife, Cassandra Cassatt, who was considered a leading society figure at that time. This is her picture from Vogue magazine. More small world stuff. Cassandra Cassatt was the niece of Plunkett Stewart. Now, next door to the Beaupre property was an estate called Glencoe that belonged to a man named Samuel Robinson. After Minnie Cassatt's death in 1954, the Beaupre estate was put up for sale. There wasn't a lot of interest in the house, there was interest in the land, and eventually that would be sold and developed. but the house was kind of a white elephant at that time. Samuel Robinson, who was president of the Acme Markets, whose estate was next door, purchased the house and some surrounding land, and being very involved with the Presbyterian Church, donated it to the church, and it would become the Presbyterian Home for Women. Over the years, it evolved into more of a life care or continuing care community. It still is today. The house is beautifully preserved, and it's now known as the mansion at Rosemont. Well, our final Cassatt member is the brother of Alexander and Mary, J. Gardner Cassatt. He's the one who takes on from his father and continues the family's involvement in banking and oversees Cassatt and Company. He will marry Eugenia Carter, nicknamed Jenny, who's from an old Virginia family. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Carter name. And their city house is on Locust Street, another work by Furness and Evans. And happily, in recent years, it's been beautifully restored by the Library Company of Philadelphia and is used for residential use for visiting scholars and research fellows. Around 1907, they purchased land in Berwyn for their country house, about 120 some acres. It's on the opposite side of Berwyn from the Chesterbrook farm. It's south of the railroad tracks and of Lancaster Avenue, whereas Chesterbrook was considerably north. And so Gardner and Jenny Cassatt hire an architect named John Demwolf to design this house. Now, he's probably not as familiar to a lot of you as one of the Philadelphia architects' names, but he was very accomplished, but more known in the York and Lancaster area. And I think he may have been hired because he did a number of commissions for Cassatt and Company, the banking house. He also, if any of you have ever been to the York Country Club or some of the more notable residential areas in York, Demwolf is the architect. Well, with this love of all things French, it's not surprising that the style of this house is very much in a French mode, and it soon became nicknamed the Chateau out in the area. They had 3 children, a son Gardner, daughter Ellen Mary, and another daughter Eugenia. Ellen Mary Cassatt, as you can see appropriately here, continues the great family interest in all things involving horses and hounds. She will marry Horace Binney Hare, who becomes master of foxhounds of the Radnor Hunt, and she and her husband and family will be the ones who will take over Kelso after the death of her parents. Her sister, who is very interested in continuing sort of the farming tradition in the family, has a property called Crumdale Farm. First, she's married to a man named Charles Davis, then later Percy Madeira. But she's profiled in a variety of magazines, and here you see an article for her successful breeding of Guernsey dairy cows. And notably here, this is not a country gentleman farmer, it's a country gentlewoman farmer. The house Kelso, by the early 1950s, the family, it's a great expense to keep up. They really don't want to continue to use it as a primary residence, so they put it up for sale. The Norbertine Order of Monks purchases it to use as sort of a retreat house. But by the early 1960s, they've consolidated on another estate, not that far away, called Dalesford, now Dalesford Abbey. So they sell the house and a lot of the surrounding land, which is then developed. But the house itself is purchased by the Upper Mainline YMCA, and it is still the steward and preserver of the house today, and a number of the other buildings on the property, stables, carriage houses, and garages. A separate barn, which is all brick, substantial structure, was spun off and turned into a really beautiful residence today that borders on this estate. Now, this is an aerial image of Kelso. I wish I had a better image. This was sent to me decades ago, a photocopy Never been able to locate the actual aerial view, but I did want to use it anyway, and I hope you can see it because it kind of brings us back to connecting the Cassatt family together. Now, up at the very top would be Lancaster Avenue and the railroad tracks. The entrance was along Sugartown Road, and if you drive along there today, you'll still see these brick gates, the remnants of that estate. You would have turned in and driven up a long road past the garages and other features into the entrance courtyard for the house. And you would have passed a 600-foot-long pool of water surrounded by poplars and dogwoods that would bloom in the spring. It's a feature that's fascinated me, and there's nothing else I've seen that's quite like it on the main line. I don't know who the landscape architect was, but I do know Gardner Cassatt and his sister Mary were very close, and they visited, Gardner visited over in France regularly, would go out to Mary's chateau outside of Paris. And if you read about that chateau, it had a remarkably similar feature. So I think that's the design inspiration that Gardner and Jenny Cassatt took. The water feature is still there today on the edge of the YMCA property. This is a photograph from just 2 or 3 months ago. So to conclude, it's kind of bringing me all back to Philadelphia at that time, the influence of the Cassatts, but this interconnected world. So here we have the board of the Pennsylvania Railroad. There's Alexander in the red circle. All of these titans of industry and finance, they're controlling not only that, but the cultural institutions, the social institutions and events. And here's Colonel Thomas Scott's portrait on the wall over there to the left. So many of them have a point of mutual interest in meeting. The Radnor Hunt Club, which at that time was still in its Bryn Mawr location, it wouldn't move out to the country to Malvern until the early 1930s. So many of these men are riding to hounds multiple times a week in the fox hunting season. They're attending the key social events out in the country, the Devon Horse Show being primary amongst them, now 125 old. The clubs they're going to, the Philadelphia Country Club, which was on the edge of Ballackinwood in Philadelphia at that time, started out more focused on coaching and polo, and then evolved into a golf club and a social center. The Marion Cricket Club, I've already mentioned, which you see here, evolved from a center for cricket to lawn tennis, other racket sports like squash, and also a place for social activity for dining and entertaining. So many of these people summered together and wintered together. As I mentioned, Maine was a primary destination, Mount Desert Island. A lot of the families, like the Griscoms and others, went to Rhode Island, particularly Jamestown and Watch Hill, Rhode Island, not so much Newport. And in the winter, they're in Palm Beach. And we think often of Palm Beach now as a very New York place in the wintertime. Back in the earlier days, it was a Philadelphia retreat dominated by Philadelphia families. They attended in the city a variety of events, went to the orchestra, danced at the assembly balls, and this really defined this social network and business network of people. I guess it's very fitting that the Church of Redeemer, Old St. David's Church on the main line, if you wander around these cemeteries and graveyards today and look at the stones, you're going to see a who's who of all these different people. And so particularly fitting is the fact that Alexander and Lois Cassatt are right next door to their next door neighbors from Haverford, Clement and Frances Grisco, these very good friends coming together in the afterlife as well. Thank you, and thank ICAA and all the people who've been so supported and provided so many of the great images that made this talk possible tonight.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for telling us more about the Cassatts and their magnificent homes on the main line. Jeff will take questions from the audience if you want to put them in the chat function or the Q&A. I have one question for you, Jeff. and that is, are there any Cassatt descendants still in the area, or any of the houses open to the public?
Um, the first question answered, there are descendants in the area. They don't have the name, Cassatt name anymore, but they're members of the Meggs family. Remember, I mentioned Ellen Mary Meggs. Other family names that people may have heard of over the years, Frasers, McGuires, where certainly the Scott family connecting into the Cassatts. So there are still people, but the Cassatt family members who were sort of the next generation down, are grandchildren of Alexander and Lois Cassatt, as so often happened, they ended up in Aiken or Camden, South Carolina, or Mount Desert Island, Maine, living there year round. Houses open. Kelso, the Upper Main Line YMCA, I think periodically they do have open houses, or there's an ability to see that. Dolabrand, the Clement Grisco house, is a wonderful property, and every once in a while that's been on some sort of house tour or presented in a lecture. But most of the others are either gone or they're private residences. Now with Beaupre, which is now the mansion at Rosemont, periodically they do events, sort of marketing events to try and open and show the house and talk about continuing care there. So that's another opportunity to see one of these Cassatt houses.
And what is the connection, if any, to Cassatt Road in Berwyn?
Okay, great question. I probably should have explained that. So that runs from Lancaster Avenue, and before the bridge was closed a number of years ago, it went right from sort of downtown Berwyn over the railroad, did a jog, and then over, and then went all the way down to Chesterbrook Farm. So to the Cassatt property that was their farm. So was definitely named for them.
And here's another question. Did Tiffany have a connection with the Cassatt family? And what is the story behind the stained glass windows at Church of the Redeemer?
I don't think there was a direct connection other than that's who you went to for the best of stained glass windows at that time, was really Tiffany, or perhaps John Lafarge. But so many people went to Tiffany, and particularly in these wonderful churches in these areas in the cities or in the suburban areas where there was great wealth, you're likely to find stained glass windows by Tiffany, other works of art by Tiffany incorporated into those different spaces. So I think it's probably because Tiffany's who you went to. Now, Tiffany was also doing work for private residences, and there are a number of houses around Philadelphia in the main line that had commissioned Tiffany windows. So they would have been very much known as the place to go to for a memorial window at that time.
And the next question, was the furniture for these houses antique or newly custom made?
Good question. At this time, so much of it really was revival style furniture that sort of was appropriate to the style of the house: Gothic revival, Renaissance revival, French style furniture in the later 1800s. And also Furness was commissioning a lot of works. He was working with the cabinet maker Daniel Pabst and others to do furniture and carving and other things. So at that time, the more eclectic work really is being directed in a lot of ways by the architect. Around the turn of the century and then the first decade or so of the 20th century, you're going to find a lot more purchasing of actual antiques, particularly French, that are being used to furnish music rooms or dining rooms or ballrooms in these French-inspired houses.
And did the French paintings in the house of A.J. Cassatt eventually enter public collections or private?
Most of them are public collections, and most of them are at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, although some at the Met and other major museums. They did pass down to the next generations of the family. Lois bequeathed a number to her daughter, Elsie Stewart. She'd had a little bit of a falling out with her son, Robert, so he did not get as many of the Impressionists. Some of them ended up in the Scott family. And so it's the heirs or the next generations who made the determination where they would go. But with the strong connection to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, so many did end up there that came out directly out of the family. And I highly recommend, there's a catalog of an exhibition that was done a number of years ago called Mary Cassatt in Philadelphia, which illustrates a lot of these paintings, but also tells a lot of the story of her art and then her family and connections.
And then one last question. Do the Cassatts have any connection to the Stotesbury family?
Good question. And I'd say the connection is more business than social. The Stotesburys really were on their rise at about the time that Alexander Cassatt died. And Stotesbury, because of his prominence in the banking world, he was the president of Drexel and Company. Because of that influence, certainly there's connection back and forth, but the Stotesburys at that time tend to be more in the orbit of the Wideners and Elkins and other, because their houses are sort of Elkins Park, Wynmore on that north side of Philadelphia. But I haven't found any instances of, sort of like intermarriage or really strong connection between the two families.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. That was a wonderful, fabulous presentation. And we're so grateful to you and so grateful for all of you for joining us. And from ICAA, thank you. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. And thank you all for watching.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.